Hey y'all, welcome to Sandy's Library. I'm Sandy.
And I'm Sara. In today's video, we'll begin the story of my maternal great-grandmother, Viola Williams Phillips.
And y'all, there's a lot to tell, so we've decided to break up my grandparents' stories into multiple videos. This one will cover my grandmother's early years. And y'all, I just gotta say, there is so much wrong with our half-cousin's bio of my grandmother in his manuscript. Problem is, he bought into Aunt Allie's version of her sister, my grandmother. But anyway, Sara and I are going to correct those mistakes in these videos. And y'all, be warned, there are a lot of errors and falsehoods in his bio. And I'm going to try not to get mad, but I do resent the misrepresentation of my grandparents in his manuscript. I'll own that. And one of the first misleading statements that he makes about her is that she didn't care much for her name. That's putting it mildly. She loathed her name. She hated it, hated it, hated it. And she didn't have the option of going by her middle name either. She didn't have one. We don't know why that is. All we know is Sissy hated Viola. I mean, y'all think neither of my daughters are named Viola. So anyway, let's go back to the beginning, back to when she was born, and Sara's going to tell us a little bit about that.
Viola was the sixth child of William Lawrence Williams and Elizabeth Azaline Fuller, otherwise known as Willie or W.L. and Lizzie. Sissy was born January 5th, 1897 in Bray, Ashley County, Arkansas. She was baptized into the RLDS Church on February 28th, 1907 in Eris, Louisiana by J.M. Simmons and confirmed by J.M. Simmons and W.H. Hampton.
And just as an FYI, the RLDS Church's address was Eris, which is in Jackson Parish. But the church was actually located in southwest Washita Parish.
In our half-cousin's manuscript, he adopts a bunch of tall tales as told by Aunt Allie as the gospel for my great-grandmother's childhood.
Yeah, see, Aunt Allie liked to pretend that she had dragged herself up from the depths of poverty, and she wanted everyone to admire and praise her for just how far she had climbed, too. Like I said before, the Williams family was not as dirt poor as Aunt Allie liked to claim. And you know, I wouldn't have had a problem with her playing out that fantasy of hers if she hadn't dragged my grandparents and my grandmother's siblings through the mud just to make her point. Anyway, back to Sara.
Sissy attended Guyton School. Aunt Allie told our half-cousin that none of the kids got very far in school because Willie needed them to work on the farm, but that Sissy did know how to read and write.
Well, that's very magnanimous of Aunt Allie. Most of it's a load of crap, too. Because, look, if all that stuff about Willie needing the kids to work on the farm is true, then why is there that photograph from 1910 of the Guyton School's classmates where a 13-year-old Sissy and her younger school-age siblings are all in the picture? What do they want us to believe Willie did? Send the kids to school for the day just to get their picture taken? Give me a break. Nobody, least of all our half-cousin, shouldn't have believed everything Aunt Allie said. Anyway, back to Sara.
During Sissy's childhood, her family was constantly moving between Arkansas and Louisiana. In December of 1903, they arrived in Dierks, Arkansas, and based on historical facts, we know that Aunt Sally was born October 14th, 1903 in Louisiana. So we believe they probably left Louisiana as soon as or shortly after Lizzie had recovered from giving birth.
That had to be tough, any way you look at it. And most of the Williams children said that during these moves, they had to walk alongside of or behind the wagon. Man, that's close to 250 miles of walking. Anyway, let's get back to Sara and Christmas Eve of 1903.
The Williams family went to a Christmas party at the RLDS church in Dierks. This was the first time my great-grandparents ever met. She was 6, nearly 7, and he was 9, going on 10. Sissy said the thing she remembered most about that day was the Christmas tree and all the presents underneath it. My great-grandfather, however, it seems that what he remembered most was the little dark-haired girl with the beautiful blue eyes.
FYI, Sissy and Grandpa's eyes were nearly the same color. It's also worth noting that Sara has Sissy's eyes. But yeah, my grandfather loved to tell the story of when and how they met. He was still telling it by the time I came along, and he'd tell it to anybody who would listen to him. He always proclaimed that he had no idea back then that he'd grow up to marry her one day. I can still hear him telling people, "You never can tell who you'll end up falling in love with and marrying." And then he'd wrap up his story with that unique, boisterous laugh of his.
The thing that makes this story so special is that just a few weeks later, the Williams family returned to Louisiana while the Phillips family remained in Arkansas. It would be another 10 years or so before they'd see each other again.
Know what I wish I could ask my grandfather now? Was Sissy the reason he left Arkansas and went to Louisiana instead of following the rest of his family to Texas? And why I never thought to ask him is beyond me. Maybe it had something to do with him not ever really wanting to talk about his family. But again, let's not get ahead of ourselves, and we'll talk more about the Phillips family later. Right now, let's get back to Sissy's childhood. And one of my favorite stories from her is the one about the ice apple tree. And Sara's going to tell us about that little incident right now.
My mom always says that my great-grandmother was one smart cookie, and the ice apple incident shows just how clever and quick-witted Sissy actually was. It said that her father Willie loved his prized ice apple tree for its flavor and unique appearance. The fruit was described as being a pale green, but once it ripened, they say it turned as white as milk. Willie must have thought this tree was really something, because the first year it bore fruit, the kids slipped around and knocked all the apples off the tree. After that incident, someone told Willie this would ruin the tree and to not let the kids knock the apples off, but instead let them fall off naturally.
The identity of the apple whisperer has been lost with time, but Willie must have trusted this person wholeheartedly, because the next year he was very particular about that damned apple tree. He warned all the children not to knock the apples off, too. The rule was they had to wait until the apples fell to the ground before they could claim them.
But kids are kids, so what do you think happened? Yep, they went for the apples while they were still on the tree. Not to be outdone by the kids, where do you think the Williams children got their persistence and determination from? So Willie takes a brush broom and sweeps around underneath the tree, clearing out everyone's footprints. He told the children If I see a track under that tree, I'm whipping the one who puts it there.
So, WL thinks he's got the kids beat and goes off to do his field chores. Meanwhile, Allie, yes, the one and only Aunt Allie, and their stepsister Mamie, who were both little, asked Sissy to get them an apple. Sissy said she didn't like telling them no, but she had to do what Papa said. She had to stay away from those apples. A day or two later, while Sissy was bringing in water, she noticed that a couple of apples had fallen to the ground. Her first thought was to run for the apples, but she hadn't forgotten Papa's warning. Whoever's tracks are under the tree, well, they're going to get a whooping.
Sissy was her father's daughter, though as evident by the clever solution she came up with to get those apples and keep herself out of trouble. She went into the house, put on her father's Sunday shoes, and headed outside, straight to the apple tree, where she grabbed those 2 apples off the ground. Now let's be real, 2 apples wasn't gonna be enough for all those kids, but Willie had told them specifically not to knock the apples off the tree, but he didn't say anything about shaking it. So Sissy shook the tree, 6 or so apples dropped to the ground. She gathered them up and handed them out to her siblings and step-siblings and then went back inside.
Yeah, my grandma was quite clever and rather creative.
When Willie came in from the fields and saw his own footprints under the tree, he said, "I guess y'all minded me. I don't see anybody's tracks under there but mine." Sissy couldn't help but giggle, knowing what she'd gotten away with.
It's said, in fact, that Sissy laughed so much, everyone thought she was going to give herself away. And if Willie did suspect the truth, he never let on. And you know, I, for one, would like to know what happened to the old ice apple tree. It's a shame we all couldn't have got a cutting off of that thing.
Right? A lot of the stories my mom tells us sound fun, but Sissy also had her fair share of heartache too.
That's very true. She used to tell me stories about her stepmother Jessie. See, my grandmother was 11 years old when her mother died in 1908 and 12 when Willie remarried to a local widow, Jessie Walters Mobley.
I don't know what Jessie's problem was or why she had to be so mean to the kids.
Sissy used to tell me about how Jessie was so mean to her that she'd run off into the woods and hide, where she'd cry and cry and cry for her mother Lizzie. And Sissy said that her mother would come to her and sit with her and hold her and talk to her, comforting her. Sissy definitely painted a picture in my head with her words. And hey, maybe that's where I got my gift for creative writing from. But anyway, I can still picture Sissy as a young girl sitting along the banks of the creek that was fed from the Blue Hole, which was a natural spring that formed a pool deep enough for us to swim and play in. Anyway, I can see her sitting there with her mother, and it makes me happy and sad all at the same time.
Sissy worried about her mother a lot. After she died, her religious faith caused Sissy to question her mother's whereabouts. For some reason, Sissy thought her mother was stuck in limbo or something. We're not sure why that is.
Yeah, I wish I had thought to ask. But I was a kid, not a grown-up trying to record the family history.
Hindsight is a wondrous thing. Nevertheless, Sissy was so worried about this. She had dreams where angels would come to her and tell her that her mother was in the realms of glory.
I don't really understand that, but it always made Sissy feel better. I guess we all cope in our own ways. And maybe another way of coping with the loss of their mother were the pranks that she and her brother Bud used to play on one another.
It is a well-known fact within our family that Sissy and her brother Bud loved to prank each other when they were kids. And they were always trying to one-up each other too.
One story that really sticks out in my memories that Sissy used to tell happened when she was about 12 or 13, as best she could remember.
Sissy says this was the last trick that she ever played on her brother too. It was that time when she hid outside trying to scare him, and it backfired on her as he ended up sneaking up behind her where he almost shot her.
And there will be more details about that particular incident in Uncle Bud's bio. But anyway, for now, it's Uncle Bud's turn to prank Sissy.
And since her prank happened at night, he figured his should too. Plus, he knew exactly how to get even with his little sister. Every evening after supper, when the dishes were done, Sissy would walk over to her Aunt Emma Thornell's house, where she had cousins close to her own age. Plus, Emma was her mother Lizzie's sister.
Sissy often told me that visiting Aunt Emma made her feel close to her mother. But anyway, back to the story.
Sissy would sit and talk with her cousins until about 9 o'clock, then she'd walk back home.
By herself, in the dark. She wasn't stupid, though.
No, she wasn't. She had a blade from an old straight razor that she kept on her person for protection. It's believed that Bud didn't know about the blade. If he had, he probably wouldn't have thought scaring her while she was walking home alone on a dark, deserted road was a good idea. But since he didn't know about the blade, Bud decided that jumping out of the bushes would scare the dickens out of her, especially if he planted seeds in her head before she left home. So one evening after dinner, when Sissy was about to leave, Bud says, "You better quit going up there in the dark and walking back home alone. A ghost is gonna get you."
And of course, my feisty little grandmother, who was all of about 5'3" tall, comes back with, "I'm not afraid of no ghost," and heads out the door.
Once Sissy was gone, their father Willie presses Bud about this ghost business. When he hears of Bud's plans to scare Sissy when she's walking home later that night, Willie warns his son, "You'd better be careful with her. She's a mess."
And by mess, he meant she don't take shit from nobody.
Nevertheless, Bud was determined to teach his little sister a thing or two about pulling pranks. He boldly told his father, "I'm going to get back at her." To which Willie says, "Yeah, and she might just do you like you did her." Naturally, Bud dismisses Willie's warning. Instead, he drapes himself in a white sheet and lays in wait along the dark and desolate road for his unsuspecting sister to come walking back home. When she did, he ran out of the bushes and yelled, "Boo."
Now, Sissy may have been carrying an old blade for protection, but she wasn't expecting this. In fact, she said it scared her half to death. And to make matters worse, she didn't recognize Bud's voice when he yelled, "Boo."
So what does Sissy do? Yep, she pulls out her blade and starts slashing at her ghost. All the while, Bud is trying not to get cut, and he's trying to tell her that it's him and to please stop before she cuts him.
Sissy was very adamant every time she told this story. The good minute or two went by while she's wildly slashing at him before she recognized his voice under the sheet. And when Bessie Malone Tullis, Sissy's niece, through her sister Ina, told this story, she always ended it by laughing and saying, "And they said Aunt Sis had that sheet just a-flying." And yep, according to Sissy, this was the last time they ever tried to scare one another. And I guess so. Last time, he almost shot her, and this time, she almost sliced him up. It's a wonder they survived.
Sissy had several courtships with young men in the community during her teenage years, yet she never entertained any of them seriously until she became reacquainted with my great-grandfather, Joseph Irwin Phillips.
Their marriage will be our topic for the next video, so until then,
thanks for joining us today. We'll be back soon with another video about my great-grandparents, Viola Williams and J.E. Phillips.
later Gators.